Hello, everyone. It's Philip Lee returning with a new episode of Civil War Chat. And today is Monday, the 13th of June. Our topic today is Ulysses Grant's overrated presidency. Ulysses Grant's presidency deserves a fresh analysis because modern historians and biographers have lifted him too high. Initially, their so-called rehabilitation of his previously mixed reputation concentrated on his military performance during the Civil War, but more lately it has included his presidency. In 1948, for example, Grant ranked near the bottom at 28th out of 30 presidents. But in 2017, a separate survey ranked him in the middle of the pack at 22nd out of 41 rated presidents. The ranking improvement reflects two factors. First is an increasing focus on his civil rights policies on behalf of the Blacks, if not other minorities. Historians who came of age during or after the 1960s civil rights movement tend to concentrate on the racial aspects of Reconstruction. In 2008, in a 2018 interview, for example, Ron Chernow proclaimed Grant to be, quote, the single most important president in terms of civil rights between Abraham Lincoln and Lyndon Johnson, close quote. Second is a tenacious propensity among modern historians to minimize the corruption that plagued his presidency, as well as an inclination to dismiss any suspicions that he may have been personally culpable. Regarding the first point, today's historians too often fail to critically evaluate Grant's motives for supporting Black civil rights, particularly voting rights. He is commonly portrayed as promoting them as a noble stand for racial equality. They fail to adequately examine evidence that his prime motive may have been instead to gain the political power that a routinely obedient voting bloc could provide to Republican candidates. Consider, for example, that only a minority of America's whites voted for Grant when he was first elected president in 1868, despite his popularity as a war hero. His 300,000 popular vote majority resulted from winning 90% or more of the votes among the mostly illiterate ex-slaves. More importantly, Grant may have limited his civil rights advocacy to Blacks, since they composed the solitary minority group that could be politically significant. He did nothing for smaller racial minorities such as Indians, Chinese Americans, and other immigrant groups. In fact, at the end of the Civil War, Grant even opposed voting rights for Blacks, including those who were Union veterans. His move toward Black suffrage over the next 3 years paralleled his increasing intimacy with radical Republicans and fully crystallized with his nomination for president on the Republican ticket in May 1868. Indians generally could not vote during Grant's administration. Moreover, in 1875-76, he secretly provoked a war with tribes in the northern Great Plains. He wanted to give white men access to doubtfully valuable gold deposits in the Black Hills in order to help America's economy recover from the depression that followed the panic of 1873. Although the war is best known for the fight at Custer's last stand, the US Supreme Court ruled a century later that it was illegal and awarded over $100 million in damages to tribal descendants. Chinese Americans were also generally denied the vote. They could not even become naturalized citizens until 1943, even though they never numbered more than 10% of California's population. They represented about 2/3 of the state's lynch victims between 1849 and 1902. In fact, by some estimates, the biggest lynching in American history took place in Los Angeles during Grant's first presidential term in 1871. 19 victims were Chinese Americans. The 19 victims were Chinese Americans. Since the 14th Amendment only granted citizenships to Blacks born in America, Grant signed the 1870 Naturalization Act in order to enable Blacks born elsewhere to become citizens. But the act deliberately excluded Chinese Americans and other so-called non-whites. In 1875, he signed the Page Act that restricted entry into America by Chinese immigrants and other undesirables, quote, undesirables, close quote. The 1875 Civil Rights Act also failed to include Chinese Americans. In Driven Out, the Forgotten War Against Chinese Americans, Gene Palzer explained the effect of such restrictions and omissions. Quote, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 and the Page Act of 1875 removed the right of Chinese immigrants to ever become citizens and banned the immigration of most Chinese women, close quote. As for the dubious ethics displayed by Grant's administration, there were at least 10 incidents of malfeasance connected to it during his 8-year presidency. The sheer number and frequency repeatedly signified Grant's association with men of questionable character, and that it may also hint at his own potential culpability. Consider, for example, the president's conduct during the whiskey ring scandal, which involved tax evasion and bribery in the distilled spirits industry, which was the top source of domestic internal federal tax revenue. Ultimately, the Treasury's investigation led to the threshold of the presidency when Grant's personal secretary, Orville Babcock, was indicted as a leading ring conspirator. Grant responded by first trying to move the trial to a friendly military court, since Babcock was also an Army officer. But a Justice Department prosecutor blocked the move by noting the procedural violations that would result from removing evidence from the court of jurisdiction. Second, he hired a spy to infiltrate the prospectors. Grant hired a spy to infiltrate the prosecutor's office, but the spy eventually sided with the prosecution. Third, he fired an assistant prosecutor whose comments during a jury summation he found to be personally offensive. Fourth, he forbade prosecutors to plea bargain with low-level conspirators as a means to convict high-level participants. Fifth, 2 days before Babcock's trial, the Treasury Department's chief clerk wrote future Supreme Court Justice John Harlan, "What has hurt Treasury Secretary Bristow worst of all and most disheartened him is the final conviction that Grant himself is in the ring and knows all about it," close quote. Grant also used a law commonly associated with protecting Black civil rights in the South to police voter registrations in the big northern cities where growing immigrant populations were steadily strengthening the Democrat Party. When the wife of Attorney General George Williams accused Grant of using Secret Service funds to benefit Republican candidates in New York City, the president explained that the money was spent in compliance with the 1871 Ku Klux Klan Acts to pay for voter registrations. You see, the money wasn't really used against the Ku Klux Klan, as modern biographers say. A lot of it was used to be sure that Democrats couldn't register as freely as they would like in the northern cities. Grant was also an eager participant of valuable gifts for which he would reciprocate with patronage appointments. Between 1865 and 1869 inclusive, donors bought or gave him enough money to buy a total of 4 homes in Galena, Illinois, Philadelphia, Washington City, in Long Branch, New Jersey. One of the 7 donors to the 27-room Long Branch, quote, cottage, close quote, was Tom Murphy, who was who had been a notorious supplier of shoddy merchandise to the Union Army during the Civil War. Grant later appointed Murphy as customs collector for the Port of New York, where 3/4 of the America's tariffs were collected. It was the most lucrative patronage assignment available in the federal government. Anybody that had that assignment somehow managed to have the money that passed through the port stick to their fingers. That's just the way that business was done in the 19th century. Similarly, Grant assigned General Daniel Butterfield to New York's Sub-Treasury Office in exchange for raising a fund enabling General William T. Sherman to buy Grant's Washington home at a price that was more than double the price Grant had paid only 3 years earlier. Soon after his appointment, Butterfield took a sizable bribe, to join Jay Gould's attempted corner of the gold market. In September 1869, historians specializing in the Civil War and Reconstruction era may sometimes be more persuaded by Grant's words than his actions. But as J.P. Morgan once remarked, a man always has 2 reasons for the things he does, a good one and a real one, close quote. We know that from politicians today or politicians that I've observed throughout my lifetime. Nonetheless, Morgan was implying that the good reason is a false benevolent explanation that conceals the real self-serving one. For example, Grant justified restricting the immigration of Chinese women by implying that he wanted to avoid forcing them into prostitution. In his 1875 annual message, he said, quote, "Few of the Chinese women are brought to our shores to pursue honorable or useful occupations," close quote. But Chinese American history specialist Jean Palzer again concludes that the real purpose of the act was, quote, "to force thousands of men to return to China," close quote, since only 4% of Asian Americans in 1875 were women. Similarly, Grant initially adopted a benevolent attitude toward Indians. In his first annual message in December 1869, he announced that he had put Quakers in charge of several reservations because the sect had long coexisted peacefully with Indians. Quote, "From the foundation of the government to the present, management of the Indians has been a subject of embarrassment and attended with continuous robberies, murders, and wars. I do not hold the conduct of the whites blameless and have attempted a new Quaker managed policy with fair results so far, which I hope will become a great success," close quote. Yet his claims of good feelings proved false when he launched the Centennial War noted earlier. The Centennial War against the Plains Indians noted earlier and resulting in the Custer's Last Stand. When a group of Black leaders visited the White House to congratulate him on winning re-election in 1872, Grant told them what they wanted to hear, quote, "I wish that every man in the United States would stand in all respects alike," close quote. But to Grant, quote, "every man," close quote, did not include Indians and Chinese Americans, among other non-Black minorities. Since Grant sometimes contradicted his true meaning, since Grant sometimes contradicted himself, his true meaning, therefore, must be deduced from his actions and not his words. Yet some, I think many modern biographers too readily accept the statements that reflect upon him favorably and ignore the contrary ones. Charles Calhoun does so when suggesting, Charles Calhoun, who wrote a big book on Grant's presidency within the last 5 or 6 years. He does so when suggesting that Grant supported labor over capital in the 1877 railroad strike during the first year of the ensuing Rutherford Hayes presidency. While complaining that the press had been overly critical of his use of federal troops in the South, Calhoun quotes Grant as whining, quote, "Now, during this 1877 railroad strike, however, there is no hesitation about exhausting the whole power of the government to suppress a strike on the slightest intimation that danger threatens," close quote. But in an August 27th, 1877 letter to brother-in-law Abel Corbin, Grant displayed a hard stance toward labor. Unlike the sympathetic one implied above, he wrote his own brother-in-law, quote, "My judgment is that the strike should have been put down with a strong hand so severely as to prevent a like occurrence for a generation." Finally, even though Grant's fundamental interest in Black civil rights may have reflected the power of the group's voting bloc more than the morality of racial equality, it ultimately failed to be enough to sustain his support. The moment of truth came during the autumn 1875 elections in Mississippi and Ohio. Mississippi carpetbag Governor Adelbert Ames twice asked Grant for federal troops to police the polls on election day, but was turned down. It would be another 40 years before former Republican and Black Mississippi Congressman John Lynch revealed that Grant had confessed to him in November 1875 that Ohio politicians told the president that intervention in Mississippi's elections would likely cause Republicans to lose Ohio. Back in those days, even the northern states did not approve of federal government interference in state elections. So basically, what happened is that Grant traded a Republican victory in Mississippi for a bigger one in Ohio. Thereafter, the Republican Party steadily lost interest in Southern Blacks. Understanding Grant's roller coaster reputation begins with a study of contrast. In a mere 7 years, he rose from obscurity to the presidency, only generally to skid downward from his inauguration day to the end of his second term. That is the preface to this book, U.S. Grant's Failed Presidency. You can get it for $22 at Amazon, or that is in paperback. Of course, there's Kindle version available. And if you'd like to have an autographed copy, it would be $26, and I'll cover the delivery here in the United States. But to get the autographed copy, you need to email me, Phil, P-H-I-L _Lee, L-E-I-G-H at me.com. And that's our show for today. Thanks for watching.